There is a kind of cold that does not bite. It does not nip at your fingers or sting your cheeks the way an honest winter does. It simply opens you, quietly, the way a man opens a letter he already knows he does not want to read, and it pours itself inside, and it takes everything you were before and folds it small enough to lose. Della Whitlock learned the name of that cold on the worst night of her life, standing in the frozen ruts of a dying mining town with a stolen letter in her boot and 3 copper pennies in her glove. She did not yet know that the same night would hand her the only safe place she would ever have. She did not know that the giant who would stop his wagon in the snow that evening had buried 2 people already and sworn he would never carry the weight of a third. She did not know that the man chasing her down out of Denver had hired 3 riders and that one of them was, at that very hour, only 19 miles behind her, asking questions in a saloon she had passed through that morning. All she knew, as the last lamp in Cut Bank went dark and the wind came down off the mountain like something with teeth, was that she had finally run out of road. This is the story of how she found the end of it and what was waiting there. The wind came down through Halloran Pass, carrying the cold smell of wet stone and the iron promise of snow. Della stood in the mud of the only street Cut Bank had, and the mud had already taken the heel off her left boot, and the cold had already taken the feeling from her toes, and the dark was taking everything else. She had been a respectable woman once. The thought arrived with a strange, distant clarity, the way thoughts do when the body has begun to give up on the person living inside it. She had worn gray silk to a governor's reception. She had played 4 pieces on a rosewood piano for a room full of men who owned half the silver coming out of these mountains. She had been told by a dressmaker on Larimer Street that she had the kind of neck a jeweler dreamed about. Now the mud had her, the way the mud here had everything. It pulled at her ruined boots with every step, and it smelled of horse and rot and the long, indifferent cold. And it did not care one particle who she had been. The saloon doors swung shut 20 feet away. She heard the bar drop across them from the inside, a flat, wooden sound like a coffin lid. The yellow light in the window guttered and died a moment later. Somebody inside that warm room had decided the night was over and had not spared one thought for the woman standing in the street, because nobody in a town like this spared a thought for a stranger after dark. A stranger after dark was either dangerous or already dead, and either way you bolted your door. Della pressed her back against the rough plank wall of the assay office. The wood was damp and gave her nothing, no warmth, only a break from the wind that came tearing down the pass. She dug her fingernails hard into her palms. She was not going to cry. Crying burned heat she did not have to spare, and besides, there was no one to see it and no one to care, and a thing nobody sees is not really happening at all. That had become her philosophy in the last 2 days. If nobody saw it, it was not real. She had decided this somewhere west of the last station, and it was the only thing holding her together. It had been 2 days since the stage had rolled out of Cut Bank without her. 2 days since she had stood at the mouth of the depot, watching the dust of it climb the switchbacks and reached into the bodice of her dress for the small leather purse that held everything she had left in the world, and found the seam slit clean, and the purse empty, and the woman who had sat beside her for 9 hours, the kind woman with the bag of peppermints and the gentle questions about where Della was bound and whether anyone was expecting her, that woman was gone. Gone with the stage, gone with the money, gone with the careful future Della had stolen out of a drunk man's desk drawer in Denver and carried 400 miles into the mountains. A dog trotted past her in the dark, ribs showing through a coat matted gray with old snow. It did not look at her. It knew better than to expect anything from a thing that stood so still in the cold. Della understood. She had become invisible. She had become weather. That was when she heard the boots. Down the boardwalk, heavy and unhurried, a slow, flat rhythm against the planks. Della went still against the wall. In a town like Cut Bank, a woman alone in the dark was not a person. She was an opportunity. She slid her right hand into the pocket of her coat and closed her numb fingers around the only weapon she had, a brass paper knife with a dull blade and a heavy handle, a thing she had taken from the same desk drawer as the money, for no reason she could name at the time except that it had been her father's. It was useless. She knew it was useless, but it was metal, and it was hers, and her hand felt better holding it. The man came off the boardwalk and into the street, and Della understood at once that the paper knife would do nothing at all. He was enormous. He was the wrong size for the world around him, too big for the stunted, wind-bent pines, too big for the low shacks, too big for the mean little street. He wore a heavy coat of buffalo hide gone bald in patches, worn through to cracked leather at the elbows, and a slouch hat pulled low so that his eyes were two pale gleams under the brim. He was not looking at her. He was wrestling a sack of grain that must have run 50 pounds up onto the bed of a battered wagon, and the two mules hitched to it stood with their heads down and their breath pluming white, looking as though they had given up on the whole enterprise of living some years ago. The man heaved the sack over the tailgate. It hit the boards with a dead, heavy thump, and Della, against her own will, shivered. A full, hard shudder that ran the length of her and rattled her teeth in her head. The man stopped. He turned, slowly, the way a big thing turns, with the unhurried certainty of something that has never in its life needed to move quickly.
His face came into the thin light off the snow, and it was a hard face, a landscape of weather and pale stubble and skin creased deep at the corners of the eyes. And it was not a kind face, and it was not a cruel one. It was an indifferent face. He looked at her the way a man looks at a fence post he is fairly sure he did not leave standing where it stood. Della held her breath. Her fist tightened on the brass knife in her pocket. He looked at her a moment longer, then reached into the wagon, pulled a heavy oiled canvas over his supplies, and lashed it down with two pulls of a rope through the iron cleats. The rope rasped. The mules shifted. He worked with an economy that suggested he had done this exact thing 10,000 times and had not enjoyed any of them. "Stores closed," he said, without looking at her again. His voice was low and rough, the sound of two stones ground together. "I know," Della said. Her own voice startled her. It was thin, reedy, scraped down to almost nothing. None of the polish she had spent her whole life acquiring. The warm, clear finishing school tone she used the way other people used a weapon. It was the voice of someone who had not eaten in nearly 2 days and had not been warm in longer than that. The man finished his knot, and then, instead of climbing up to the driver's seat, he simply stood there in the mud, letting the first dry flakes of snow gather on the brim of his hat. He looked at her ruined boots. He looked at the hem of her skirt, stiff and black with frozen muck. He looked at the way her shoulders would not stop shaking. He did not ask her name. He did not ask where her husband was, or her father, or whatever man a woman like her was supposed to belong to. He did not ask what she was doing, standing outside a shuttered store in the first hour of a mountain blizzard, with no bag and no coat worth the name. "You're going to freeze to death against that wall," he said. It was not a warning.
It was a flat statement of arithmetic. "I'll manage," Della said. It was a lie, and they both heard it land as a lie. The man made a short sound through his nose, an exhale that might have been a laugh in some other man who still had laughs in him. He turned and walked to the front of the wagon and ran his hand down the harness of the nearer mule, checking the buckles. "Suit yourself," he said. And panic came up in Della's chest, sharp and cold and sudden as a hook. He was leaving. The last living soul on this street was about to climb onto that wagon and disappear up the black mouth of the pass, and she would be alone, and she would die here against this wall, and nobody would ever know her name. The understanding was not dramatic. It did not come with tears. It came as a heavy stone settling into the bottom of her, the simple weight of a fact. "Wait," she said. The man paused with one hand on the rein. He looked back at her over his shoulder. Della's throat worked. The words tasted like ash on her tongue, like the last thing a proud person ever swallows. "I don't have anywhere to go." The wind kicked up the pass and threw a fistful of ice crystals against her cheek, and they stung like a handful of needles, and her eyes watered, and she hated that they watered, and she would not let it become anything more than that. The man watched her for a long, terrible moment. He did not soften. His pale eyes moved over her with the same flat assessment a stockman gives an animal that has wandered onto his land in a storm, weighing whether it is worth the trouble of saving and what it might cost him if he tried. Then he let go of the rein. He walked back to the tailgate of the wagon, unlatched it, and let it drop with a clatter that echoed flat off the dead storefronts. "Come up to my place and eat," he said. "It ain't far."
It was not a question. It was not an invitation.
It was an order, given the way you give an order to a thing that has stopped being able to make its own decisions. Della stood frozen. She thought of the paper knife in her pocket. She thought of every story she had ever heard about the men who lived alone up in these mountains, men who had not seen the inside of a church or the face of a woman in years, men who came down out of the high country once a season for salt and powder and went back up half wild. She thought about getting into a wagon with the largest man she had ever seen and being driven into the dark, into the trees, into a place no one knew existed. Then the wind came through her wet clothes again and reached all the way to the marrow of her bones, and a clear, small voice in the back of her mind said, very calmly, that if this man meant to kill her, at least it would happen indoors, in the warm, and that was more than the wall behind her was offering. She pushed off the assay office and dragged herself toward the wagon.
The bed of the wagon smelled of wet canvas and axle grease and the cold metal tang of the iron tools lashed beneath the tarp. Della wedged herself into the corner, between a crate that smelled of dried apples and the 50-pound sack of grain, and pulled her knees to her chest. The man, who had still not given a name and had not asked for hers, reached over the side without a word and dropped a stiff, folded blanket of gray wool onto her lap. It was heavy. It smelled powerfully of wood smoke and old sweat and something animal underneath, and she wrapped it around herself like a second skin and did not care how it smelled because it was the warmest thing that had touched her in 2 days. He climbed up onto the seat, the whole wagon listed under his weight. He clicked his tongue once, slapped the leather lightly across the mule's rumps, and they leaned into their traces, and the wagon lurched, and they were moving. The road out of Cutbank climbed at once.
There were no springs under the wagon bed, and every rock and frozen rut in the trail came straight up through the boards and into Della's spine, a hard jolt that knocked the air half out of her each time. She kept her eyes fixed on the broad, immovable back of the man on the seat. He sat hunched against the driving snow, shoulders square, and he did not look back at her, not once, and he did not speak. They climbed. The air thinned and the cold sharpened until it was no longer something the body could argue with. The pines crowded in close on both sides of the trail, their branches bowed under loads of old snow, and now and then a branch dragged along the canvas with a long, tearing sound that made Della's heart climb into her throat. The first relief, the animal relief of being out of the wind and inside something moving toward warmth, began to fade, and a colder thing crept in to replace it. She was entirely at this man's mercy.
He could stop the wagon right here, in the black trees, and do anything he wanted, and there was not one soul on this earth who knew that Della Whitlock had ever set foot in Cutbank. Not one person who would think to look for her. She had spent 2 days making herself invisible, weather a thing nobody sees, and now the invisibility she had prayed for had become the most dangerous thing about her position. Her fingers found the brass knife through the cloth of her coat and held it. "Who are you?" she asked. The wind tore the words out of her mouth the instant they left it, and she was certain he had not heard. They rode another minute in silence, the only sound the suck and pull of the mule's hooves in the deepening snow. Then, without turning around, he said one word. "Silas." She waited for more. There was no more. "Della," she offered after a while. Her voice shook. "Della Whitlock." He did not answer that either.
But she had the strange sense that he had filed it away somewhere, the way he had lashed the canvas, neat and final. They rode on. The sleet had given over to snow, fat, slow flakes now, and the flakes came down so thick they blanketed the trail and muffled the world until the only proof of motion was the swing of a single small kerosene lantern hung from the side of the wagon box, throwing its yellow light in lurching arcs against the tree trunks as they passed. Della's teeth would not stop chattering. Her feet had gone past hurting and into a frightening nothing. She tried to wiggle her toes inside her soaked boots and felt none of them move. A new fear came up to sit beside all the others. Frostbite. If she lost a foot, she was finished. A crippled woman with no money and no name in this country was a corpse that had not yet been told. Is it much farther? She made herself ask, hating the small, broken waver in the question. Mules smell the barn, Silas said. 10 minutes later, the trees broke open. The wagon lurched out into a small clearing, and through the falling snow, Della saw it, the dark, squared-off shape of a cabin set against the white slope of the mountain. It was nothing to look at, logs chinked with mud and a roof pitched sharp to shed the snow, but a thin gray ribbon of wood smoke was curling up from the stone chimney, lazy and unbothered, and to Della that ribbon of smoke was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen in her life. "Whoa," Silas said, and drew back on the lines, and the mules stopped blowing. He climbed down. His boots crunched deep in the fresh snow. He came around to the back, dropped the tailgate, and looked at her. "Get down." Della tried. She put one hand on the side of the wagon and swung her legs over, and the moment she set weight on them, they buckled, both at once, folding under her like wet paper. She grabbed the wagon and gasped as her frozen muscles screamed. Silas let out a breath.
It was a heavy sound, the sound of a man being mildly, predictably inconvenienced by the universe. He stepped close. He reached up and wrapped two enormous hands around her waist, and there was nothing at all in the grip but function, no gentleness and no leer, the same grip he would put on the grain sack, and he lifted her out of the wagon and set her on her feet in the snow. Her legs gave out at once. He caught her by the upper arm before she went down, and his hand closed like a vice, hard enough to bruise through the wool of her coat. He held her up and looked down at her, and she looked up at him, and the snow came down between them. "Feet don't work," he said. It was not a question, and not quite a complaint. It was a diagnosis, and without another word, he bent and scooped her up, one arm under her knees and one across her back, the way a man lifts a child or a wounded animal, and Della gasped and threw her arms around his thick neck before she could think better of it. Up close, he smelled of wet wool and pine pitch, and underneath that, the faint copper of dried blood somewhere on his sleeve. He did not strain under her. He carried her up the 3-plank steps to the porch, kicked the heavy slab door open with the side of his boot, and ducked inside. The dark of the cabin was thick and close, and smelled of cold ash and old tobacco. Silas crossed the room in 3 long strides and set her down, not gently, into a high-backed wooden rocker beside a stone hearth where a few coals still breathed orange under a gray skin of ash. The sudden loss of his body heat made her shake harder. "Boots off," he said, and struck a match against the stones. Della fumbled at her laces with fingers that would not obey. She watched him touch the match to a nest of kindling already laid in the grate. The little flame caught the dry moss, then the pine twigs, and the good clean smell of wood smoke filled the room, and a wash of weak heat reached her, and she nearly wept at it. Silas turned and saw her losing the fight with her wet, knotted laces. He crossed to her, dropped to one knee, and batted her hands aside. Della went rigid. Her breath caught. A stranger's huge hands had closed around her ruined boots. But he did not linger. He worked the wet knots loose with a surprising, almost delicate dexterity, peeling the soaked leather off her feet. Her stockings underneath were soaked through and frozen stiff, and he pulled those off too, businesslike, and Della squeezed her eyes shut, burning with shame at the sight of her own feet, the toes, gone a pale, waxy blue. "Don't put 'em by the fire," Silas said, standing, tossing her boots toward the door. "They'll thaw too quick. Hurts like the devil. Take 'em slow." He went to the oak table and struck another match to a wick in an oil lamp, and the golden light flared up, and the cabin came out of the dark. It was a hard, plain, practical place. A black cast-iron stove squatted in one corner. Shelves along the far wall held jars of put-up food, dark and unlabeled. Traps hung from the rafters by their chains. There was a single narrow cot against the far wall, covered with a heavy bear hide. One bed. Della swallowed and pulled her knees up and tried to draw her bare blue feet back from the growing heat of the fire. Silas did not look at her. He lifted a heavy iron skillet off a hook, set it on the grate over the flames, and went to a ladder leading up to a loft. "Said I'd feed you," he muttered. "Ain't much, but it's hot." The sound of thick-cut salt pork hitting hot iron was the loudest thing in the world. It hissed and spat, throwing tiny stars of grease into the fire, and the flames jumped orange. Della sat rigid in the rocker.
As the feeling came back into her hands and feet, the numbness gave way to a deep, burning ache, as though someone were driving hot needles into the soles of her feet and the tips of her fingers, and she clenched her jaw and made no sound. She watched him cook. He moved with an economy that only comes from years of having no one to do a thing for but yourself. He wasted not one step. He halved an onion with a wicked hunting knife, the blade flashing in the firelight, and scraped it into the rendering fat, and the sharp, sweet smell of it hit Della in the stomach like a fist. Her belly cramped hard and let out a long, hollow growl, loud in the quiet room. Silas did not look up, but he reached into a tin, took a handful of dried beans, dropped them into a smaller pot with a dipper of water from the bucket by the door, and set the pot at the edge of the coals. "Takes a while to boil," he said quietly. "I can wait," Della said. She lied. She felt as though she could have eaten the leather of her own ruined boots. It had been nearly 48 hours since anything had passed her lips but handfuls of snow. He took a stale loaf from a cloth sack, cut 2 thick slices, and laid them on the hot hearthstones to toast. Della watched him and looked for the tell, the glance at her bare ankles, the lingering eye, the thing every man she had ever known had wanted, sooner or later, whether they admitted it or not. Her father had wanted obedience. Arthur had wanted a thing to display and a thing to break. The men in the camps she had passed through wanted flesh and made no secret of it. There was always a price, and she had learned to find it early, the way you learn to find the snake before you reach for the firewood. Silas seemed to want nothing at all. He watched the fat bubble in the skillet. After 10 long minutes, he used a rag to lift the skillet off the fire, took down 2 battered tin plates, laid a piece of charred bread on each, and divided the greasy pork and onion over the top. He handed her a plate and a fork. The heat of the tin scorched her palms, and she did not let go. He sat down on a thick wooden stump on the far side of the hearth and began to eat without ceremony, without watching to see whether she liked it, shoveling the food in with a blunt efficiency. Della tried to take a polite bite. She lifted a piece of pork to her mouth and chewed, and the hot grease coated her tongue, salt and rich, and something in her snapped clean through. She forgot the finishing school. She forgot the gray silk and the rosewood piano and the neck a jeweler dreamed about. The desperate animal that lived under all of it took the reins, and she tore at the bread and shoved the pork and onion into her mouth and chewed fast and swallowed hard.
She burned the roof of her mouth, felt the blister rise instantly, and did not care. When the plate was clean, she ran her fingers through what was left of the grease and licked them. She sat back, breathless, her belly heavy and aching and full, a dull warmth finally spreading out from her center, and she looked up. Silas was watching her. His own plate rested half-eaten on his knee. He was looking at her with those pale, flinty eyes, and a flush of deep humiliation climbed Della's neck. She lowered her gaze and wiped her mouth with the back of her wrist and felt her chin slick with grease. I'm sorry. I was hungry." "You were hungry," Silas said, finishing it for her. He looked back down at his plate and took another bite. "Ain't a sin." The silence came back, thick and full, broken only by the crack of the fire and the wind throwing snow at the dark window panes. Della set her empty plate on the floor. The heat of the room and the weight of the food in her belly dragged at her eyelids. 2 days of fear and cold rose up all at once and pulled her down like an undertow. She looked at the single cot in the corner. Then she looked back at Silas. Here it came. The price. "Where," she said, her voice gone tight, "where do I sleep?" Silas stood. He set his plate on the table, crossed to a cedar chest at the foot of the cot, opened it, and drew out a great heavy quilt of mismatched squares, faded calico, and wool. He carried it back and dropped it across her lap. It was heavy enough to push the breath out of her. "Chair," he said, "or the floor by the hearth. Floor's harder, but it's warmer." Della blinked at him. "And you?" "My bed," he said, as if she had asked something foolish. He went to the door, checked the heavy iron bolt, came back to the lamp and blew it out, and the room dropped into darkness, lit only by the dull orange breath of the dying fire. She heard the rustle of clothing, the heavy creak of rope springs taking his weight, and then the long, even breathing of the big man settling into the dark. He had not touched her. He had not asked for one thing. Della sat in the rocker with the heavy quilt clutched to her chest and listened to the wind and to the slow breathing across the room. And for the first time since she had stepped down off that stage into the mud of Cutbank, a single tear broke loose and ran hot and fast down her cheek, cutting a clean track through the soot and grime. She pulled the quilt up over her head and curled herself small in the chair and wept without a sound. It was not fear. It was the overwhelming, terrifying knowledge that for tonight at least, she was safe.
19 miles down the mountain, in the back room of the saloon in Cutbank, a man named Roy Decker was warming his hands at a stove and listening to the barkeep tell him, for the third time and for the price of a second whiskey, about the strange, thin woman who had come through 2 days back. Pretty, the barkeep said. Talked fancy. Spooked, though, like somebody'd been after her. Stage left without her, way I heard it. Town's small. She didn't get on no other stage, 'cause there ain't no other stage. He shrugged. She'd be froze in a ditch by now, you ask me. We had weather. Roy Decker said nothing. He was a narrow man with a narrow face and small, careful eyes, and he had been paid in Denver gold to find a woman and bring back word of where she was, and he was a patient man, and patient men did not freeze in ditches. He had 2 others riding with him, gone soft and warm into rooms upstairs, and they would not like the cold of the high pass. But the man who paid them, the man with the manicured mustache and the gold watch and the smile that did not reach his eyes, that man did not pay for things he did not get. "Anybody live up the pass?" Roy Decker asked. The barkeep thought about it. "Couple trappers, hermit or two. There's a big fella keeps to himself up past Halloran. Comes down twice a year for salt." He poured himself a short one. "But he don't take to company. You'd not want to go knocking on his door uninvited, friend. Believe me on that." Roy Decker looked into the stove and watched the coals and said nothing at all. And outside, the snow came down, and the pass closed itself behind Della Whitlock 1 foot at a time, and neither she nor the man who had carried her up it knew yet that the closing of it was the only thing that would keep her alive. Morning did not come gently. It hit the frost-caked windows like a flat white broadside, a blinding glare reflecting off the new snow that left Della blind for the length of a breath. She woke with a sharp gasp, her neck cramped at a vicious angle against the hard back of the rocker, and for 3 full seconds she did not know where she was. She smelled sharp, burnt coffee and old leather and cold ash. Then the dull throb in her thawing feet announced itself, and the whole of it came down on her at once. The mud, the empty purse, the wall, the wagon, the giant. She opened her eyes. The cabin was bitterly cold. The fire had burned down to a bed of glowing red coals that threw just enough heat to keep the water in the bucket from going solid, and Silas was already awake. He sat at the oak table with his broad back to her, working a wet whetstone in slow circles over the curved blade of a hatchet. Scrape, shh, scrape, shh. The sound set her teeth on edge. She moved, and her joints cracked like dry kindling, and her whole body ached, bruised by the stage and the mud and the unforgiving chair. She pulled the heavy quilt tighter around her shoulders and shivered as the cold air found the damp sweat in the collar of her dress. Silas did not turn around. "Coffee's on the stove," he said. "Grounds are thick. Chew 'em if you want." His voice was a low gravel rumble, empty of any morning courtesy. Della stood up gingerly. Her feet shrieked. The flesh was swollen, tender, mottled, an angry purple. She put 1 foot down on the freezing boards and winced as pain shot up her heel, and she limped to the stove. A battered blue enamel pot sat on the warming plate. She poured a cup, and the dark stuff sludged out thick into the tin, and she took a sip. It was brutally bitter, tasting of burnt wood and cheap chicory, and it was hot, and it sent a vital, burning line straight down her throat and into her belly. She stood with both hands around the cup, letting the steam warm her nose, and looked down at herself. Her dress, once a respectable navy wool, was finished. Caked with dried mud at the hem, wrinkled past saving, smelling of wet sheep and unwashed fear. Her hair, which she had once kept pinned in tight, neat coils, hung in greasy, tangled ropes around her face. A sudden, violent surge of shame went through her. In the life she had run from, she would not have let a servant see her like this, let alone a man. She had been raised to be an immaculate thing, a porcelain figure on a shelf, right up until the creditors came and the porcelain shattered on the floor. Now she was a beggar in a filthy dress drinking mud water in a stranger's shack. "I need to," she started and stopped. The humiliation burned her cheeks. She had to relieve herself, and the thought of asking this giant where a person was meant to go knotted her stomach. Silas paused the whetstone. He did not turn. He pointed the hatchet handle toward a canvas curtain strung on a sagging wire in the back corner near his cot. "Pot's behind there," he said. "Don't go out. Wind's coming up. You'd lose your way 10 foot from the door and freeze before you found it again." Della stared at the curtain. The degradation was total, but her body would not be argued with. She limped over, drew the stiff canvas aside, and handled her business in mortified silence, praying the howling wind outside swallowed every sound. When she came out, she felt a heavy, bone-deep exhaustion that had nothing to do with sleep. Silas had not moved. He was testing the hatchet's edge against the rough pad of his thumb. Della wanted to be useful. She needed to be useful. Some animal part of her had already understood the math of her situation. She had to earn her square foot of warmth, or this man might decide one morning that she was more trouble than she was worth and put her back out in the snow. She crossed to the stove and reached for the heavy iron skillet from the night before, meaning to scrape the congealed grease from it. Her fingers, still half numb and clumsy, slipped. The skillet hit the floorboards with a deafening iron clang. Della flinched so hard it sent a jolt of pure panic through her chest. "I'm sorry," she gasped, dropping to her knees to snatch at the handle. "I'm sorry, I was only trying to—" "Leave it," Silas's voice cut across her. Della froze on the floor, her breath caught in her throat. She waited for the blow, or the shout, or the curse. The men she had known threw things when they were crossed. They struck out when something of theirs got broken, even something as small as a quiet morning. Silas stood. The chair scraped loud against the boards. He crossed to her. He was not angry. He looked, if anything, tired. He reached down, closed one enormous hand around her upper arm, and lifted her to her feet with no apparent effort at all. "Hands are soft," he muttered, turning her pale, trembling fingers over. "Skin's frostbit. You grab cold iron, you'll tear the hide right off your palms. Sit down." He did not wait for her to argue. He picked up the skillet, took up a rag, and went to work on it himself. Della retreated to the rocker and sat rigid, clutching the tin cup. He had not hit her. He had not even raised his voice past a grumble, but the plain truth of his assessment stung worse than a slap. Hands are soft. Useless. She was entirely, completely useless in this world, and they both knew it. By noon, the second storm came in, and it came in with a full and terrible force. It was not snow so much as an assault. The wind shrieked around the eaves of the cabin like something dying, and the heavy log walls shuddered under it. The sky went a suffocating, bruised gray, and the snow blew sideways and packed itself against the windows until the glass was a solid sheet of white ice, and the cabin, which had felt sparse and empty in the night, suddenly felt the size of a coffin. Della paced, 2 steps from the hearth to the table, 2 steps back. The rhythmic creak of the boards under her bare feet was the only thing keeping her tethered to herself. Silas was mending a broken harness. He sat on the floor near the stove with an awl and a length of heavy waxed thread, working in complete silence, the muscle in his jaw jumping as he pulled each stitch tight. He had been at it for 2 hours. He had not spoken a single word. The silence clawed at Della. She was a creature of noise. The chatter of drawing rooms, the clink of teacups, the cries of peddlers in the street, the rising, drunken rant of the man she had run from. To her, silence had always meant a predator had gone still, that something was about to happen, that you had better find out where the danger was before it found you. "Do you ever talk?" she demanded, the words tearing loose before she could stop them. Silas did not look up. He punched the awl through the thick leather. "Shuck." "Talk when there's something needs saying," he said. "Nothing needs saying." Della let out a short, jagged laugh that sounded unhinged even to her own ears. We are trapped inside a wooden box while the world ends out there, and you are sitting there as though it were a Sunday afternoon in July." "It's just winter," Silas said, pulling the thread through. "Happens every year." "I am going to go mad," her hands balled into fists. She wanted him to react. She wanted him to shout, to argue, to do anything human at all. "I am staring at a wall of ice. I smell like cold grease, and my feet feel like they are on fire." Silas stopped. He laid the harness across his knees and looked up at her. His flinty eyes moved slowly over her, taking in the fists, the pale face, the wild tangle of hair. "You're alive," he said flatly. "Yesterday you were fixin' to die against a wall. Today you're warm enough to complain about how you smell." The blunt truth of it hit her like a fist to the chest. The fight went out of her all at once and left behind a hollow, sickening wave of shame. She swayed where she stood, the sudden drop knocking her lightheaded. Silas sighed, the same heavy, inconvenienced sound he had made when her legs failed her in the snow. He tossed the harness onto the table, stood, crossed to the cedar chest, rummaged inside, and came up with a heavy flannel shirt, faded to a washed-out red, smelling of lye soap and cedar shavings. He threw it at her. It hit her in the chest, and she scrambled to catch it. "Get that wet dress off," he said, turning his back and walking to the stove, taking up an iron poker and jabbing at the coals. "Hang it by the fire, not too close, or it'll singe." Della stared at his broad back. "Take my dress off." "It's damp. Damp kills in this air." He did not turn around. "I ain't looking at you. Put the shirt on." She hesitated. Every instinct she had screamed at her to keep her armor on, however wet and heavy. But the cold damp of the wool had soaked into her bones and brought a deep marrow ache, and she was so tired of being cold. She turned to face the dark corner. With trembling fingers, she worked at the stiff little buttons down the front of her bodice, the fabric crusted with dried mud, and it took agonizing minutes, her breath catching every time the wind howled or Silas shifted near the stove. She peeled the heavy dress off her shoulders and let it drop in a sad, wet heap, and stood in her thin cotton chemise and petticoats, equally damp and grimy, and shivering hard, she pulled his red flannel over her head. It swallowed her. The hem fell to just above her knees, and the sleeves hung inches past her fingers. It was rough against her skin, and heavy, and blessedly warm. She rolled the sleeves back, baring her bruised wrists, and gathered up her ruined dress and draped it over the back of the rocker, pulling it nearer the hearth. When she turned around, Silas was looking at her. He did not look at her bare legs below the hem, or at the thin, damp cotton showing through the open front. He looked at her face. "Better?" he asked. Della pulled the collar tighter around her neck. She felt utterly exposed and, strangely, safe. The shirt smelled like him, wood smoke and pine and a clean, masculine sweat. An intimate, overwhelming smell. "Yes," she whispered, looking at the floor. "Thank you." He gave a single, short nod, sat back down on the floor, took up the awl, and went back to his harness. The silence came back, but the teeth had been pulled from it. It was no longer a stalking thing. It was only quiet. The light died early, at 3 in the afternoon, swallowed by the storm. Silas lit the oil lamp, throwing long, jumping shadows up the log walls. The cold deepened. The wind found every fissure in the mud chinking and pushed thin blades of freezing air into the room. Della sat close to the stove, with her knees pulled up under the hem of his shirt, and watched him work. He had moved from mending leather to cleaning a heavy lever-action rifle, and the smell of gun oil mixed with the wood smoke. He worked with the same steady, practiced rhythm. Strip the action, wipe the bore, oil the works. He did not rush. He had the patience of a stone. Della watched his hands. They were huge, scarred, the knuckles thick and split white with old breaks. And then she saw it, a thick, jagged ridge of pale flesh running up his left forearm, disappearing under the rolled sleeve of his underwear. It was not a knife scar. It looked like something had tried to tear the meat off the bone. He caught her looking. He did not cover it. He kept wiping the barrel. "Bear," he said, his voice quiet under the wind. Della blinked, startled that he had volunteered a word. "Grizzly sow," Silas said. He set the rag down. 5 years back. Caught me dressing a deer in the brush. Didn't hear her coming." He looked down at the rifle. Took half my arm and a piece of my thigh. I bled in the snow 3 hours before I could crawl back to my horse. Mule brought me down off the mountain. He turned the rifle over. Sal got the deer. I got the scar. Fair trade, I reckon. It was a terrifying story told with the bored ease of a man remarking on the weather. Della pulled her arms tighter around her legs. You didn't want to leave after that. Go somewhere safer.
Silas looked at her. The lamplight caught an amber fleck deep in the dark of his eyes. Safer where? He said. It was not a question. Towns are full of men. Men are worse than bears. A bear just wants to eat. A man wants to own you. The words went into Della like a blade. They slid past her ribs and settled cold and heavy in her lungs. A man wants to own you. She looked away, into the bright coals through the grate of the stove, and in the twisting flames she saw Arthur's face. The perfectly waxed mustache, the gold watch on its chain, the smile that never once reached his eyes. The way his hand had closed around her throat the night she told him she would not sign over the last of her father's shares. Her own hand drifted up without her telling it to, fingers grazing the base of her throat where the yellowing bruises still hid under the collar of Silas's shirt, where she could still feel the phantom press of 2 thumbs. Silas watched her hand.
He saw the way she touched her neck and the way her eyes went hollow and far away. He knew that look. He had seen it on dying animals, and he had seen it once in a piece of broken mirror. He did not ask. Instead, he stood, set the rifle on the table, crossed to the corner, took hold of a big, galvanized tin tub, and dragged it scraping into the center of the room before the hearth. Della came out of the memory with her heart slamming. What are you doing? Silas went to the stove and took up the 2 heavy iron kettles he had set there earlier and carried them to the tub. Steam billowed as he poured the boiling water in. He took the cold bucket from the door and dumped half of it in to temper the heat. Water's hot, he said. He took a rough linen cloth and a block of yellow lye soap from a shelf and set them on the rim of the tub. You smell like a wet dog. Wash. Della stared at the steaming water. A hot bath. It was an impossible luxury, a thing she would have dreamed of and dismissed. But the tub stood in the dead center of a 1-room cabin. I can't, she stammered, her face going hot. You're right here. Silas did not roll his eyes, but the heavy breath he let out said everything his face did not. He walked past her, took his buffalo coat and slouch hat off the peg by the door, and shoved his arms into the thick sleeves. Where are you going? Panic spiked. You said the wind. There's wood needs stacking, he interrupted, pulling the hat down tight. Take your time, holler when you're decent. Don't fall asleep in there and drown. He threw the bolt. The wind roared into the cabin, stealing the warmth and flinging snow halfway across the floor, and Silas stepped out into the howling white and pulled the heavy door shut behind him. She heard the bolt slide home from the outside, and then the cabin was quiet, and Della was alone. She stood, her legs trembling, and approached the tub. The steam rose in thick, inviting plumes. She stripped off his shirt and let it fall. She untied her petticoats and slipped out of her chemise, and the cold air of the cabin bit at her bare skin and raised gooseflesh down her arms and thighs. She stood naked in the firelight, and without the heavy wool armor, she looked frail. Her ribs showed too sharp under pale skin. Bruises in purple and sour yellow mottled her hips from the long, jolting stage, and a dark, thumb-shaped mark stained the pale flesh above her collarbone. She stepped into the tub. The water was brutally hot, just short of pain, and she sank into it with a stifled sob. The heat folded over her, melting the agony out of her muscles, drawing the deep chill up and out of her bones. And it was so good, so overwhelmingly good, that it brought tears to her eyes. She took up the rough block of lye soap. It smelled sharp and caustic, stripped of any perfume, and she scrubbed her skin pink with it. She washed the mud from her legs, and the grime from her neck, and the cold sweat of 2 days' fear off her chest. She ducked her head under and worked the soap through the matted ropes of her hair until they ran clean and squeaked between her fingers. When the water began to cool, she stood, shivering, and dried herself fast with the rough linen, her teeth chattering, and pulled her chemise back on, cold and damp and all she had. and over it the giant red flannel. She wrung the water from her hair onto the boards. She felt raw, scrubbed down to something new, clean of the road and the mud and a little of the fear. She crossed to the door and stood with her hand hovering over the wood, and something twisted tight in her chest. He had gone out into a killing blizzard so that she could be alone to bathe. He was, in all likelihood, freezing in a drafty woodshed at this very moment. She pounded on the heavy timber. "I'm finished," she called, her voice cracking.
10 seconds passed, and the bolt rattled, and the door shoved inward, pushing a foot of drifted snow across the floor. Silas came in on a blast of Arctic air, his heavy coat caked in solid white ice, frost clinging to his brows and stubble, a golem made of winter. He set his shoulder to the door and forced it shut against the wind and through the bolt. He did not look at her. He stood on the mat, shedding his frozen coat, knocking ice off his boots. Della stood by the stove, clutching the towel, and watched him. "He must be frozen," she said quietly. Silas hung his coat. He turned around. His face was pale with cold, his cheeks flushed a dark red. He looked at her. Her face scrubbed clean, her dark hair hanging in damp, clean waves over the shoulders of his red shirt. She did not look like a muddy stray anymore. He went to the tub, took the handles, and, without a word, dragged the heavy, water-filled tin to the door, cracked it open, tipped the dirty water out into the snow, and slammed it shut again. "Wood stacked," he said, going to the fire and holding his huge, numb hands out to the heat. He did not look at her again. "Go to sleep." The storm did not break. It settled into a grinding, monotonous siege that erased the line between day and night. By the third morning, the damp chill Della had carried in her bones since the stage finally collected its debt. It did not begin with a cough. It began with a creeping ache low in her back that spread outward, turning her muscles to water and her joints to ground glass. She sat in the rocker, huddled under the heavy quilt, staring blindly at the flames, shivering, though her skin felt tight and hot. She clamped her jaw to keep her teeth from chattering. Silas was at the table, oiling a pair of leather boots with a rag and a tin of rendered fat. He had enough to carry without a sickly stray dying in his front room. A dry scratch formed at the back of her throat. She swallowed, trying to force it down. She took a shallow breath, and it caught, and she coughed. It was a harsh, rattling, tearing sound that ripped through the quiet cabin like splitting canvas. Silas's hand stopped. He did not turn at once. He slowly set the tin of grease on the table, wiped his fingers, and turned his head. Della coughed again, doubling over as a sharp pain spiked behind her ribs. She clamped a hand over her mouth, eyes streaming with the force of it. When she finally caught her breath and looked up, her vision swimming, Silas was standing over her. He did not ask how she felt. The question was beneath them both. She looked like death. He reached out and pressed the back of one massive, calloused hand to her forehead. His skin was rough and smelled of leather and oil, and it felt blessedly, shockingly cool against her burning brow. "Fever," he muttered, and his jaw tightened. "I'm fine," Della rasped, hating the thin, reedy sound of her own voice. "Just caught a draft." He ignored the lie. He turned on his heel and went to the shelves and took down a small, unmarked jar of stripped dried bark, pinched some into a tin cup, and poured boiling water over it from the kettle. "Get in the bed," he ordered. Della blinked through the fever haze. "The cot? No, I can't take your—" "Get in the bed." His voice did not rise, but the flat authority in it pinned her to the chair. "You die in that rocker, I gotta dig a hole. Ground's like iron right now. I ain't doing it." It was a brutal, practical logic that somehow walked clean past her pride. She nodded weakly and pushed the heavy quilt off her lap and tried to stand, and her legs failed her, knees buckling the moment they took weight, her vision tunneling into swimming dark. Silas caught her before she hit the boards. Once again, he scooped her up, and she felt weightless, hollowed out by her own heat. He carried her to the narrow cot in the corner and laid her down on the rough wool and pulled the heavy bear hide up over her shoulders, and it smelled powerfully of musk and dust and something old and animal. He came back with the tin cup and held it to her lips. "Drink." Della took a sip and nearly gagged. It was impossibly bitter, sharp and earthy, coating her tongue in ash. "What is that?" she choked, pushing his hand away. "Willow bark brings the fire down in the blood. Drink it." He offered no sugar to chase it. He held the cup steady against her bottom lip until she had swallowed every foul drop. Then he set it on the floor, grabbed his coat, and went to the door. "Stay under the hide," he said over his shoulder, and threw the bolt, and was gone. For the next day and night, Della floated through a broken country of heat and shivering cold. She dreamed of the stage, the endless jolting, Arthur's face sneering as he snapped his gold watch shut. She dreamed of the mud of Cutbank rising up to swallow her waist, her chest, her throat. She thrashed, kicking the heavy bear hide off, gasping for air that felt too thin to breathe. Strong hands caught her wrists. "Hold still." Della blinked her eyes open. The cabin was dark, lit only by the dull orange glow of the banked fire. Silas sat on a wooden crate beside the cot with a bowl of melted snow in his lap and a damp rag in his hand. He pressed the freezing cloth to her forehead, wiping away the slick sheen of sweat. Della whimpered and leaned into the cold. His flannel shirt, her shirt now, was soaked through and clinging to her burning skin. She turned her head, and the collar of the shirt slipped down off her shoulder. Silas dipped the rag, wrung it, and moved to press it to her neck. His hand stopped in the air.
In the dim light of the dying fire, the dark, mottled bruises across her collarbone and the base of her throat were stark and undeniable. They were the distinct shape of a man's fingers and thumb, pressed deep into pale flesh. Della felt the sudden stillness in the room. The fever fog parted just enough for her to understand that her collar was open. Panic, sharp and jagged, pierced her chest. She snatched the heavy hide and yanked it up to her chin, her breath shallow and erratic. Silas did not move. He stared at the place where the bruises had been, his jaw locked, the muscles jumping beneath the stubble. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, heavier than the blizzard outside. He did not ask who had done it. He did not ask whether she had deserved it. He slowly lowered his hand, dipped the rag back into the cold water, and wrung it out. "Fever's breaking," he said quietly, and his voice was a low, dangerous rumble that she felt in her own chest more than heard.
"Go back to sleep." He did not touch her neck again. He folded the cold rag and laid it carefully across her forehead. And then he sat in the dark, watching the bolted door, his hand resting easy and ready near the heavy iron lever of his rifle. And he did not sleep at all. And outside, the wind came down off the mountain like something with teeth. And somewhere, far below, in the warm back room of a Cutbank saloon, a narrow man with small, careful eyes unfolded a map of the pass and asked the barkeep, very politely, to mark the trail that ran up past Halloran. The silence woke her. It was a vast, hollow quiet that made her ears ring. The relentless, shrieking assault of the wind against the logs had stopped, and the stopping of it was so total that the absence felt like a sound of its own. Della opened her eyes.
The cabin was flooded with a blinding, pure white light reflecting off the snowpack outside the window panes, and she squeezed her eyes shut again, groaning as a dull, throbbing headache pulsed behind her temples. But the fire was gone out of her. Her skin felt cool, clammy with dried sweat, but the terrible consuming heat of the fever had vanished. She turned her head on the flat feather pillow. Silas was at the stove. The smell of strong coffee and rendering bacon fat filled the air and anchored her back to the world. He had his back to her, scraping the heavy skillet with a metal turner. She pushed herself up onto her elbows, and her muscles trembled, wrung out and exhausted, but they obeyed. "The storm," she croaked, her throat raw and dry. Silas glanced over his shoulder. "Blew itself out an hour before dawn." He plated the bacon and 2 thick slices of fried bread, crossed the room, and handed her the tin plate. He did not ask how she felt. He expected her to eat. Della took the plate and rested it on her knees. She picked up a strip of bacon, her hands shaking faintly, and bit into it, and it tasted like salvation. She ate slowly, letting the heavy grease and salt settle her hollow stomach. Silas took his own plate to the wooden stump by the hearth and ate in his usual efficient silence. The light in the cabin was unforgiving. It lit the dust motes turning in the air, the deep wear in the floorboards, the stark exhaustion carved into the lines around Silas's eyes. He had not slept, not since her fever spiked. She understood that now, the way you understand a thing slowly and then all at once. Della set her half-empty plate on the floor beside the cot and pulled the bear hide tight across her lap, her fingers tracing the coarse fur. His name was Arthur. The words fell into the quiet room like stones dropped down a deep well. Della had not planned to speak. She did not want to explain herself, did not owe him an explanation.
But the memory of his eyes locked on her bruised throat in the dark demanded some kind of reckoning, and she found she could not carry it alone one more hour. Silas did not stop eating. He did not look at her. He chewed, swallowed, and stared at the iron stove door. "Didn't ask," he said. "I know." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "But you saw." Silas set his plate down on the floor between his boots. He rested his heavy forearms on his knees and laced his thick, scarred fingers together. "Seen a lot of things," he said. "Most of 'em ain't my business." "My father owed him money." The dam broke and the words came on their own. She stared at her pale, trembling hands in her lap. "A great deal of it. Mining shares that went bust. Arthur bought the debt. He came to the house in Denver and said it could all be forgiven. All I had to do was wear his ring and smile for his associates." She let out a dry, bitter laugh that caught in her throat. "I thought I could do it. I told myself it was only a transaction, the kind men and women had been making for 1,000 years. But Arthur did not want a wife. He wanted a dog he could kick when the market closed down." Her hand drifted up to the collar of the flannel shirt and pulled it tighter at her throat. "I packed one bag. I stole the petty cash from his desk drawer while he was drunk, and a letter besides, one I will get to. I got on the first stage heading west into the mountains. I did not care where it went, only that it went where he would not follow." The silence returned. It was not the awkward, oppressive silence of the first day. It was a silence heavy with the weight of the truth she had set down in the middle of the room. Silas unlaced his fingers. He reached into his shirt pocket, drew out a small tin of tobacco, and began to roll a cigarette with slow, methodical care. "A man who hits a woman ain't a man," he said quietly, striking a match against the hearthstone. He touched the flame to the paper and drew a slow breath of it, and the sweet, pungent smell drifted across the room. "He's a frightened animal trying to prove he's got teeth." He blew a thin stream of smoke toward the rafters. "He looking for you?" Della felt a cold spike of dread in her gut. "I don't know. He has the money to hire men who track things." She made herself say the rest. "People." Silas gave a single short nod. He did not look alarmed. He looked entirely undisturbed. "The letter," he said. It was not a question. He had been listening more closely than she'd thought. Della reached down to the side of the cot, to the ruined boot she had kept within arm's reach through 3 days of fever, and worked her fingers into the lining, and drew out a folded paper, soft and worn at the creases from handling. She held it out to him. Silas did not take it at once. He looked at it the way he looked at most things, weighing the cost of touching it.
Then he set his cigarette on the edge of the stump, took the paper in his huge hands, and unfolded it with surprising care, and read. Della watched his face. It did not change, but she knew what he was reading because she had read it 100 times in the dark, by lamplight, and by the swing of the stage lantern. It was a letter on the stationery of a Denver assay house, signed by a man named Pell, and it laid out in plain, dry numbers a thing that Arthur had spent 2 years and a great deal of money hiding. The mining shares had not gone bust. They had been salted, the assay reports forged, the worthless claims sold at fortune's price to a dozen investors across the territory, and the man at the center of every transaction, the man who had collected the money and burned the honest reports and let a string of ruined men believe their own bad luck, was Arthur Vane. Her father had been one of the ruined men. The debt that had handed Della to Arthur like a parcel had been built on Arthur's own fraud. "He doesn't know I have it," Della said quietly. "I found it in the false bottom of his desk drawer, under the cash. I think that is why he's truly looking. Not for me, for this."
A woman gone is an embarrassment. A woman gone with this is a noose. Silas folded the letter along its worn creases, slow and deliberate, and held it out to her. She took it back and slid it once more into the lining of her boot. "So he sends men," Silas said. He picked his cigarette back up. "How many, you reckon, for a thing like that?" "3," she said. "He always moves in threes. He told me once, drunk, it was a thing he learned in the war. One to do the work, one to watch the first, and one to bring back word that it was done." She shivered. "He likes to be told a thing is done." Silas smoked the rest of the cigarette in silence, looking at the stove.
Then he pinched the coal out between his bare fingers, the way he always did, and dropped the stub in his pocket. "Passes snowed shut till April," he said, and his voice carried the flat certainty of a man stating the depth of his own well. "Nobody tracks nothin' through 10 foot of drift. If he sends men, they gotta wait for the thaw, and then they gotta come up the canyon. There's one trail. It runs under a granite shelf for half a mile. A man on that trail is a man in a barrel." He stood, looking down at her with those pale, chipped flint eyes. "Ain't nobody coming up that canyon unless I say so. You're safe here." He did not offer pity. He did not offer some grand vow to defend her honor. He offered her geography and ballistics, and it was the most profoundly comforting thing anyone had ever said to her in her life. Della swallowed the lump in her throat, her eyes burning. "Why are you doing this? You don't know me. I'm useless here. I don't know how to cook over a fire. I don't know how to shoot. I dropped your skillet." Silas crossed to the table and picked up his heavy leather work gloves. "You survived 2 days in a freezing mud pit with a dull letter knife in your pocket," he said, pulling the gloves onto his massive hands. "You ain't useless. You just need to learn a new trade." He went to the door and threw the bolt. "I gotta dig out the mules. Stay in bed." The door opened on a blinding shaft of sunlight and a rush of crisp, impossibly clean mountain air, and he stepped out and pulled it shut behind him, and Della lay back on the cot, alone in the quiet, smelling of bacon grease and old tobacco, and, underneath it now, the sudden, overwhelming scent of hope. What neither of them said, what neither of them needed to say, was the one hard fact sitting in the room with them. April was coming. The past that kept the world out would, in time, let the world back in, and when it did, the world would not be coming up that canyon to admire the view. The thaw, when it finally came in earnest, took 3 days. The sun beat down on the mountain with a fierce, blinding intensity, turning the snowpack to a glare of dripping water and slush. The sound of running water was everywhere, off the eaves of the roof, through the swollen creek behind the cabin, dropping in heavy, wet thuds from the laden pine branches. The whole mountain seemed to exhale. Della's strength came back slowly. By the second day, she refused the cot. She took over the stove, learning through trial and burnt error how to read the heat of the coals, how to bank a fire so it held through the night, how to keep the beans from scorching on the bottom of the pot. Silas let her. He did not hover. He chopped wood, cleared the snow off the roof before its weight could break a rafter, and went out each morning to walk his trapline, returning at dusk smelling of pine resin and cold wind, with a brace of rabbits or a marten or nothing at all. They moved around each other in a careful, quiet choreography. The silence between them was no longer a cage. It had become a shared space, a thing they kept together, the way two people keep a fire. She learned things. She learned that the scar on his arm was not the only one, that his left hand had 2 fingers that would not fully straighten, broken once and set crooked by his own hand, because there had been no one else to do it. She learned that he had come up into this country 6 years back, and that he never said from where, and that the 2 graves she had glimpsed on the rise behind the woodshed, 2 small cairns of mountain stone with no names cut into anything, were the reason he had come, though he never said that either. She learned that he counted his words the way a poor man counts coin, and that when he did spend one, it meant exactly what it said. And she learned, slowly, that she was no longer afraid of him. She learned this on the 5th day of the thaw, when she dropped the skillet a second time. It clanged against the boards, and her whole body went tight, and she waited for it, the flinch, the bracing. And then she realized she was not bracing. She was only annoyed.
She bent and picked it up and set it back on the grate, and when she looked over, Silas was watching her from the doorway with the rabbits in his hand, and something at the corner of his mouth moved, almost a smile, and he said, "Getting better. Didn't jump near as high that time." And Della laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of her, the first one in longer than she could remember. It changed something between them, that laugh, though neither of them remarked on it. The careful distance they had kept, the wide, cautious space two strangers leave around each other in a one-room cabin, narrowed by some small, unmeasured amount. She found that she could be in the room with him and not be aware of him every moment as a thing to be watched, the way she had learned to watch every man in her old life. She found that the silence, which had once made her want to claw at her own skin, had become a thing she could sit inside the way you sit inside a warm coat. She began to ask him to teach her things. She did it carefully at first, the way you offer your hand to an animal that has been hurt, half expecting him to refuse, to grunt and turn away. But he did not refuse. He showed her how to read the trap line, which sets were for marten and which for fox, how to lift an animal from a trap without ruining the pelt, how to skin and stretch a hide on a frame of bent willow. Her stomach turned the first time, and he saw it turn, and he did not mock her for it. He only said, "Everything up here eats something else, you included. Ain't a shame in it, long as you don't waste what you take." And she found, to her own surprise, that she believed him. He showed her the put-up food on the shelves, the jars of dried berries and the smoked meat hung in the cold loft, and the sack of meal and the precious tin of salt, and how it all had to last until the trail opened, and how a person learned to look at a full larder in autumn and see, instead of plenty, the exact narrow line between making it to spring and not. She had never in her life thought about food as anything but a thing that appeared on a table. Now she understood it as arithmetic, as survival, as a thing you fought the mountain for, and the understanding sat in her chest like a stone turning slowly into something else. And on the fourth day of the thaw, without any announcement, he took down the long rifle and a handful of cartridges and said, "Come on." He set a flour sack on a deadfall log at the edge of the clearing and paced off 40 steps and put the rifle in her hands. And it was heavier than she expected, and cold, and she did not know what to do with it. He stood behind her, not close, never closer than he had to be, and told her how to set her feet, how to bring the stock into her shoulder so it would not break her collarbone when it kicked, how to lay her cheek along the wood, how to breathe out and find the still place at the bottom of the breath and squeeze, not pull, the way you'd squeeze the last drop from a rag. The first shot terrified her. The crack of it slammed across the clearing and bounced off the canyon walls, and the rifle drove back into her shoulder hard enough to make her cry out, and the flour sack stood untouched, and 100 yards up the slope, a startled grouse burst out of the brush. "Again," Silas said. She fired again, and again. The fifth shot, her shoulder already bruising under her dress, she breathed out and found the still place and squeezed, and the flour sack jumped and burst, and a small cloud of white drifted on the cold air, and Della stood there with the rifle smoking in her hands, and her ears ringing and her heart pounding, and she felt something she had not felt in years, perhaps ever. She felt dangerous. She felt like a person, a thing could happen to her, and she could happen back. She turned to look at Silas. He was watching her with those pale eyes, and he gave a single short nod, which she had learned by now was, from him, a standing ovation, a brass band, a thrown bouquet. "You got a steady hand under it all," he said. "Soft on the outside, steady underneath. Good combination, that. Hard to teach." He took the rifle from her and began, without being asked, to show her how to clean it. Most folks are the other way round. They practiced again the next morning, and the morning after that, and each time her shoulder ached a little less, and the flour sack burst a little sooner, and neither of them ever said aloud the reason a soft-spoken trapper was teaching a society woman to put a rifle ball where she looked. They did not have to. The reason was down the mountain, on a clearing trail, getting closer with every foot of melting snow, and they both knew it. And the knowing of it sat with them at every supper. But under all of it, under the warmth and the quiet and the slow unclenching of something deep in her chest, the dread sat and waited. Every morning she woke and looked at the window and watched the snow draw back from the clearing 1 foot at a time, revealing the dark, muddy rut of the trail that led down off the mountain. The road was opening. The world was coming back. And a road that let her out was a road that let Arthur's men in.
On the sixth night, Silas cleaned the rifle again, and then he cleaned a second one she had not known he owned, a short, heavy thing he kept wrapped in oilcloth above the door, and he laid out cartridges on the table in 2 neat rows and counted them, and Della watched him count and did not ask, and he did not explain, and they both understood that the counting was an answer to a question neither of them had spoken aloud. Roy Decker came up the pass on the 9th day of the thaw. He came with the 2 others, the soft, warm men from the rooms above the saloon, who had complained the whole way up and gone quiet now that the trail had narrowed and the granite shelf had begun to lean out over their heads. He came on a borrowed mule because his horse would not take the ice, and he came slow, reading the trail, because Roy Decker was a patient man, and patient men do not hurry into barrels. He had spent the long weeks of the closed pass in Cutbank doing what he was good at, which was listening. He had heard by and by the rest of the story of the big man up past Halloran. He had heard that the man's name was Silas, that he had buried a wife and a child up there 6 winters back, dead of a fever there was no doctor close enough to fight, and that he had not come down off the mountain right in the head since. He had heard that the man was a dead shot, and that he did not welcome visitors, and that a packer who had wandered up that trail 2 summers back had come down fast and white-faced and would not say why. None of this troubled Roy Decker overmuch. He had been told to find the woman and bring back word, and he had a description, and he had a feeling, the kind of feeling a man like him learns to trust, that a thin, spooked woman who vanished off a stage in a town with 1 road had not vanished into the air. She had gone up. There was only 1 up to go. He did not know about the second rifle above the door.
He did not know that the man he was riding toward had spent 6 years learning every yard of that granite shelf, every angle of fire, every place a sound carried, and every place it died. He did not know that the woman he was hunting had, that very morning, fired a rifle for the first time in her life, at Silas's quiet insistence, and put 3 rounds out of 5 into a flour sack at 40 paces, and that Silas had said nothing, but had nodded once, which from him was a standing ovation. He did not know any of it. He only came up the pass, slow and patient, into the barrel. The trail under the granite shelf was the worst stretch Roy Decker had ridden in 20 years of riding bad trails. The rock leaned out over their heads, dripping with the thaw, dropping the occasional shelf of rotten snow that hit the path ahead of them with a soft, heavy whump that made the mules shy and the soft, warm men curse.
On the right hand, the ground fell away into the canyon, a long, bad fall onto rocks and white water. On the left, the wall. There was nowhere to go but forward or back, single file, slow, exposed. About halfway along it, Roy Decker stopped his mule. He sat for a long moment, the small, careful eyes moving over the rock above, over the notches and folds and shadows of it, and a feeling came up in him that he did not like, the feeling of being looked at. He had felt it before, twice in 20 years, and both times the feeling had been right, and both times the only thing that had saved him was that he had learned long ago to trust it. "What are we stopping for?" said the man behind him, the heavier of the 2, a Denver tough named Pruitt, who had not stopped complaining since the bottom of the pass. "Cold's getting in my bones. Let's get up there, do the thing, get down. I don't like this rock." "Quiet," Roy Decker said. He looked at the canyon falling away on his right. He looked at the wall on his left. He looked at the long, open trail ahead, climbing toward the unseen clearing. And he thought about a man who had lived 6 years on this mountain and learned every yard of it. And he thought, not for the first time, that the money Arthur Vane was paying was good money, but that good money spent in a place like this where there was nobody to spend it. He almost turned back. Years later, in a card room in Cheyenne, telling the story to men who did not believe him, he would say it was the closest he ever came in his life to doing the smart thing, and that he had not done it, and that he had the limp to remind him. "It's a woman and a crazy trapper," Pruitt said behind him, louder now, his fear coming out as anger, the way fear does in soft men. "We're 3. We got guns. I'm froze through, and I ain't riding back down this goat path to tell Mr. Vane we got spooked by a quiet road."
He kicked his mule forward, pushing past Roy Decker on the inside, against the wall where the trail widened by a foot. "Come on!" And that, Roy Decker would say later, was the mistake. Not coming up the mountain, plenty of men came up mountains. The mistake was letting a frightened man get out in front of you on a trail where the only safe thing to do was nothing. "Pruitt," he said, low, "get back." But Pruitt was already moving, already past, already out ahead on the open rock with his rifle across his saddlebow and his head down against the cold, riding into the clearing he could not yet see, riding under the fold of rock he could not see either, where a great, gray, patient shape had been lying still as the stone itself for the better part of an hour, watching 3 small, dark riders come up into the barrel. He only came up the pass, slow and patient.
And then he was not patient enough, or one of his men was not, and the mountain did what the mountain did to men who did not respect it. Silas saw them first. He was on the rise behind the woodshed, near the 2 unnamed cairns, splitting the last of the season's deadfall, when something far down the white throat of the canyon caught his eye, a movement that did not belong to wind or water or any animal he knew. He set the axe down against the block. He stood very still for a long moment, the way he stood when he was listening to the mountain. Then he walked down to the cabin, unhurried, and stepped inside, and Della looked up from the stove and saw his face, and the spoon went still in her hand. 3 of them, Silas said, down on the shelf trail, hour out, maybe less, slow as they're moving. Della's blood went to water. The room tilted. She set the spoon down very carefully because she did not trust her hand. "Arthur's men. Reckon so." "How do you know they're—" "Don't carry traps. Don't carry a pack worth the name. 2 of 'em ride like they ain't never been on a mountain. One rides like he's looking for something." Silas crossed to the door and took down the oilcloth bundle. "Honest men got a reason to be up here this time of year. These ain't got a reason I can see, except the one you brought up with you." Della's hand found her throat. The phantom thumbs pressed. Arthur's smile that did not reach his eyes, the gold watch snapping shut. For one long moment, the old animal took her, the one that had stood invisible against the wall and cut bank, the one whose whole philosophy was that a thing nobody sees is not really happening. She felt herself wanting to make herself small, to disappear, to become weather. And then she did not. She looked at the 2 rifles and the 2 neat rows of cartridges and the man unwrapping the oilcloth, and she heard her own voice come out steady, steadier than she had any right to expect. "Tell me what to do." Silas looked up at her. Something passed across his weathered face, brief and unreadable. He had expected, she realized later, to have to do this alone. He had braced for it the way he braced for everything, as a thing to be carried by himself, because there had never been anyone to share the weight. And here she was, asking for a share. "You ever been told what to do and done it without arguing?" he asked. "No," Della said, "but I can start now." The corner of his mouth moved. He laid it out, plain and fast. The trail came up under the granite shelf for the last half-mile before the clearing, single file, no cover. There was a fold of rock above the shelf, a notch he had used for years to watch the canyon, and from that notch a man could see the whole length of the trail and not be seen, and the sound of a voice from there carried down the canyon, clear as a church bell, while a man on the trail could not place where it came from. He was going up to the notch. He was taking the long rifle. She was staying in the cabin with the short, heavy gun, behind the cedar chest he would drag against the door, and she was not to fire it unless a man came through that door. And if a man came through that door, she was to fire it into the middle of him and keep firing until he stopped, and she was not to think about it more than that. "And Silas," he said, at the door, the long rifle in his hand, "if it comes to shooting up there and it goes wrong and they get past me—" He looked at her, and for the first time since she had met him, there was something naked in his face. "The trail down's clear now. The mule on the left is gentle. You take that letter to the marshal in Helena, not the law in Cutbank, the marshal in Helena, and you put Arthur Vane in a hole he don't climb out of. You hear me? You don't stay and grieve over a stranger. You ride." "You're not a stranger," Della said. He looked at her a beat longer. Then he was gone.
Out the door and up the rise, a great gray shape moving fast and silent through the slush toward the notch above the canyon. And Della dragged the cedar chest against the door with strength she did not know she had, and she sat down behind it with the short, heavy gun across her knees, and she waited, and she listened, and she was not invisible, and she was not weather, and she was not going to disappear. It was the longest hour of Della Whitlock's life. She heard nothing for most of it but the drip of the thaw off the eaves and the hammer of her own heart. The sun crawled across the floor. The fire ticked in the stove.
Twice she nearly stood, nearly went to the window, and both times she made herself sit back down because Silas had told her to stay behind the chest, and she had said she would start doing what she was told. And then she heard his voice. It came from somewhere up and to the left, from the rock, and it carried down the canyon, clear and flat and enormous, with no fear in it at all. The voice of a man remarking on the weather. "That's far enough." The drip of the thaw seemed to stop. The whole mountain held its breath. Della could not hear the answer from the trail, only the shape of it, a man's voice, raised, surprised, casting around for where the words had come from. Then Silas again, unhurried, terrible in his calm. "You're on my mountain. There's a rifle on the middle one of you right now, and I don't miss. You're going to turn them animals around and ride back down the way you come, and you're going to tell the man that sent you that you found nothing up here but a crazy old trapper and a mountain that don't want you." A pause. The thin sound of an answer. "I know who you're looking for." Silas's voice did not change. "She ain't here, and if she was, you'd have already passed the place where I'd have put you in the snow, and you wouldn't have noticed it happen." Della pressed her back against the cedar chest. Her hands were white on the gun. Whatever Roy Decker said back, it was longer this time, a negotiation, the careful, patient voice of a man explaining his terms, offering money, the way men like that always offered money, as though money were a thing that worked on a mountain. Della could not make out the words, but she heard the exact moment the patience went out of it, heard the voice rise and sharpen, and she heard, underneath it, a second voice, one of the soft, warm men, frightened now, saying something fast and high, the voice of a man who had been sent up a mountain and was beginning to understand that he might not be coming down it. She pictured it because she could not stop herself. She had spent 2 years in rooms full of men like these, men who stood around men like Arthur and did the things Arthur would not dirty his own hands with. The patient one would be at the back, reading the rock, hating it, knowing. The frightened ones would be out in front where the frightened ones always were, their fear curdling into anger, their fingers tight and clumsy on their triggers. And somewhere above them, in a fold of cold granite she had never seen, a man whose wound she had not yet stitched and whose suppers she had shared in 100 silences, would be lying with his cheek against the stock, breathing out, finding the still place at the bottom of the breath. And then there was a shot. It was not Silas. She knew it was not Silas because it came too quick and too high, the sound of a man firing at a voice he could not find, firing at rock, firing out of pure animal fear. The crack of it bounced down the canyon and broke into a dozen echoes, and the echoes had not yet finished dying when the answer came. The answer was a single deep, flat report that she felt in the floorboards, in her chest, in her teeth. And then nothing. A held silence the length of a held breath. And then a mule screaming, and a man shouting, raw and high and broken open, the sound a man makes when the thing he was certain could never happen to him is happening to him. And then a second shot, Silas, deliberate, spaced out, the unhurried sound of a man who has all the time in the world and needs only one thing at a time. Della was on her feet. She did not remember standing. She had the short, heavy gun up, and she was at the window before she had decided to move, scrubbing the fog from the glass with her sleeve. And she saw it. Far down at the mouth of the canyon, where the trail came out from under the granite shelf, there had been 3 small, dark shapes that were 3 riders. Now, one was down. Down and not moving, a dark heap on the pale trail, a mule standing over it with its reins trailing and its head low and confused, and the other 2 were not coming up anymore. They were going down, low over their animals' necks, fast and reckless on a trail where fast and reckless was its own way of dying, and they were not looking back, not once. And one of them rode with his arm clamped hard against his side, and his shoulder dropped low. And even at that distance, Della understood that she was watching a man who had been hit and had weighed the long, bad odds of the trail against the certain odds of staying, and chosen the trail. She watched until they were gone around the bend, and the canyon held nothing but the one dark shape, and the riderless mule, and the white water, and the wind. Then she watched the rise. For a long, terrible minute, nothing moved up at the notch in the rock. The thaw dripped off the eaves. The fire ticked in the stove. Della stood at the window with the gun in her hands, and her whole life narrowed down to that one gray patch of granite. And the old voice came up in her, the one that had stood invisible against the wall in Cutbank, and whispered that everyone leaves, everyone is taken, that nothing safe is ever truly yours. And she found, standing there, that she had an answer for it, now that she had not owned a month before. The answer was that she had decided, and that if the gray shape did not rise up out of that rock, she would do precisely what he had told her. She would take the letter down to Helena and put Arthur Vane in a hole he did not climb out of, not because she was running, but because she would not let it have been for nothing. And the difference between those two things, she understood now, was the whole of what the mountain had taught her. And then the gray shape rose up out of the rock, unhurried, the long rifle hanging easy in one hand, and came down the rise toward the cabin. And Della was at the door, dragging the cedar chest away from it before she had decided to be, and she threw the bolt and pulled the door open, and Silas stood there in the cold, bright sun, and he looked at her, and she looked at him. "One of 'em won't be carrying word back," he said. "Other two will. They'll tell him there's a dead shot on this mountain, and the woman ain't worth dying for." He stepped inside, set the rifle by the door, and only then, in the light, did she see the dark, wet line down the left side of his coat, low near the hip. "You're hit," Della said. Silas looked down at it as though noticing it for the first time. "Grazed," he said. "He got off the one before I got him. Lucky shot at a voice." He grimaced, a thing she had never seen him do. Ain't lucky for him in the end.
And Della, who 4 weeks earlier had stood frozen and invisible against a wall in the mud, who had let men decide her whole life because deciding it herself had seemed impossible, crossed the room, took the big man by the arm, and said, in a voice that did not shake at all, "Sit down, take the coat off. I am going to look at that, and you are going to let me, and you are not going to tell me my hands are too soft." And Silas, the largest, quietest, most immovable man she had ever met, looked at her for a moment with those pale, chipped flint eyes, and then he sat down. It was not a bad wound, as wounds go, though Della's stomach turned the first time she peeled the bloody shirt back from it. The ball had cut a deep furrow along the meat above his hip and gone on its way, and it bled freely and looked worse than it was, and Silas talked her through it in his low, flat voice, where the clean cloth was, where the needle and the waxed thread were, the same thread he mended harness with, how to hold the lamp close, how to pour the whiskey over it before she did anything else, and not to mind that he made no sound when she did, because making a sound never helped a thing. She cleaned it, and she closed it, her hands steady, 6 small, careful stitches, and she bound it tight with strips of clean linen, and when she was done, she sat back on her heels and looked at her own work, and looked at her own hands, smeared with his blood, no longer soft, not really, not any more, and she understood that she had become, somewhere in the last weeks, without noticing it happen, a person who could do this. Who could stand in a one-room cabin while men came up a mountain to kill her and not disappear? Who could close a wound and not faint? Who could decide? Silas watched her face while she looked at her hands. "Told you," he said quietly. "You just needed a new trade." Della laughed, and it came out half a sob, and she pressed the back of her bloody wrist to her mouth, and she did not try to stop the tears this time, because there was someone to see them now, and a thing somebody sees is real, and she had decided she wanted to be real.
He healed slow, the way big men do, and the thaw went on, and the trail down the mountain ran clear and brown and open, and they did not speak of it. They did not speak of the morning, 3 weeks on, when the wound had closed to a hard pink scar and Silas could split wood again without wincing, and Della stood at the window in the early light and watched him cross the clearing to the barn and understood that there was nothing now keeping her on this mountain but her own self. The danger that had brought her up and pinned her here was gone down the canyon with 2 frightened men and a story they would carry back to Denver. The letter in her boot would do its work whether she carried it down herself or sent it. The fever was long broken. The road was open. She had run out of reasons to stay. And so, the way these things go, the question that neither of them had spoken in all those weeks finally had to be spoken, and it was Silas who could not bring himself to speak it, and so it fell to her. She was at the stove when she said it, because it was easier to say to the fire than to his face. The stage runs through Cut Bank again.
Tuesdays at noon, you said once. She kept her eyes on the beans. The trail's clear enough to make it down by nightfall. I could be on it tomorrow. The cabin went very still behind her. She heard him set down whatever was in his hands. You could, Silas said. The 2 words went through her like the cold off the wall in Cut Bank. She kept her back to him. She kept her eyes on the beans. She had survived Arthur. She had survived the blizzard and the fever and 3 men come up a mountain to kill her. She would survive this. She would. I don't have much to gather, she said, and she was proud of how level it came out. The dress is past saving. I'll need to borrow the mule, if you'll lend it, and I'll send it back up with the man at the assay office, the one who owes you the favor. She made herself ask the last of it, the polite armored thing, the porcelain thing, one final time. How much do I owe you? For the food, the medicine, the trouble. Behind her, she heard him stand. She heard his boots cross the boards, slow, and stop. She turned. He was standing in the middle of the room, his hat in his 2 hands, turning the brim around and around the way she had never once seen him do. And his face, that hard, indifferent, weathered face that gave away nothing, was doing something she had never seen it do, which was struggle. Stage runs tomorrow, Silas said. I told you that. He turned the hat. Didn't tell you to get on it. Della went still. What? She whispered. He looked away from her, at the cast-iron stove, the way he always looked at the stove when a thing was hard to say. He shifted his weight, and his boots creaked. It's quiet here, he said, low, his voice scraping like a shovel over stone. I like the quiet. Been alone up here 6 years. Don't much care for company. He paused. He made himself look back at her. But I don't much mind yours. It was a clumsy, graceless thing to say, with no poetry in it and no practice, the words of a man who had not said anything like them in so long he had half forgotten they existed. And it went into Della's chest and undid something there that Arthur and the cold and the fear had wound up tight for years. Silas. Life up here is hard, he said, the words coming faster now, as though he had to get the whole of it out before his courage failed. He was not pleading. He was laying out the terms, plain and honest, the way he laid out everything. Winters are long. Meat's tough. Ain't no silk dresses. Ain't no piano. Just mud and wood and work, and a man who don't talk much, and 2 graves on the rise back there I go and sit with when it gets bad. He swallowed. I ain't an easy thing to live alongside. I know what I am. He reached out then, his massive, scarred hand turning over, palm up, in the air between them. He did not touch her. He offered the space. But you'd never be cold, he said quietly. You'd never go hungry. And there ain't a man alive ever going to put his hands on your throat again, not while I'm standing. I'd see to that. That's the only kind of promise I got worth making, and it's yours if you want it. He looked at her, and the whole of him was there in his face, unguarded, terrified in his enormous, quiet way. You got a choice, Della. The road's open. You can take it. Or... He nodded his head just slightly toward the stove, toward the fire, toward the iron skillet warming on the grate. Or you can stay home and we can eat supper. Della stared at his open hand.
She thought of the stage, the endless jolting towns, the constant looking back over her shoulder, the whole long, unspooling rest of a life spent disappearing, spent being weather, spent being a thing nobody sees so that nobody could take it from her.
She thought of the cold and the mud and the dark street in Cutbank and the wall that gave her nothing and the woman with the peppermints who had emptied her purse and left her to die. And she understood that the road did not lead away from danger. The road only led to more road. Then she looked at the heavy iron skillet on the stove. She looked at the giant of a man who had stopped his wagon in the snow for a stranger he owed nothing, who had carried her up the mountain and pulled the frozen boots off her feet and boiled bitter bark for her fever and gone out into a killing storm so she could bathe in peace, who had counted his cartridges in 2 neat rows and gone up onto cold rock to stand between her and the men her old life had sent, and taken a ball in the hip for it, and bled and not made a sound, who had given her his shirt and his silence and his name,
Who had told her, in the only language he had, the language of geography and ballistics and a hand held open in the air, that she was wanted. She let the navy wool dress, folded over her arm to be packed, slip from her fingers. It hit the floorboards with a soft, dull thud. She did not throw her arms around him. She did not weep, though her eyes were full. She simply crossed the last of the space between them and laid her small, pale hand, no longer soft, into the center of his massive, open palm. His fingers closed around hers, warm and rough and absolute, an anchor, the first thing in years that she had reached for on purpose. "I think," Della said, and a real, quiet smile broke across her face at last, "that I would like to learn how to stop dropping the skillet." Silas's mouth twitched at the corner, that faint, almost smile, and he squeezed her hand once, gently, and let it go. He turned to the open door and called down into the bright, cold yard where the gentle mule stood half-harnessed for a trip that was not going to happen now. "Turn 'em loose," he called. "She's staying." Then he turned back to her, shrugging out of his heavy coat and hanging it on the peg by the door, and nodded at the stove. "Fire's getting low," he said. "Better build it up. Takes a while for the beans to boil." And Della walked to the hearth and took up the iron poker and stirred the glowing coals, and the sparks flew up the chimney, bright and hot and alive, and outside the last of the snow ran off the mountain in 100 small bright streams, and far down the canyon the trail lay open and empty, leading down to a world that had come up looking for her once and had been sent back without her and would not come again. The winter was not over. Up here, the winter was never quite over.
But the cold, the kind of cold that opens a person and pours itself inside and folds them small enough to lose, that cold was gone out of her for good. She had found the end of the road, the way she had set out at the start to find it. And what was waiting there, it turned out, was a warm room and a hard, quiet man, and a skillet she would, in time, learn to hold. She stirred the fire. The beans began, slowly, to boil, and behind her, Silas set 2 tin plates on the table, the way he would set them, she understood now, for a great many suppers still to come.